Now we're going to go through the diversity of plants, starting with the most primitive group that is most like the early land plants. Remember that these plants evolved from aquatic plants, so they needed to adapt to living in a dry environment without water for structural support. Gravity affected early plants in two main ways. One, of course, they had to be able to support their own weight. So these early land plants were not very tall. Also, since they were no longer surrounded by water, they had to draw water from the soil, working against gravity. The earliest land plants were bryophytes, like the mosses. Bryophytes are rootless, non-vascular plants that rely on diffusion to get water and nutrients to their tissues. We'll talk more about vascular plants in a bit. The vascular system is like a circulatory system for delivering water and nutrients. But bryophytes don't have a vascular system. Instead, they have to rely on diffusion of water and nutrients into their tissues. The problem with diffusion is that it's very slow, so this is not an efficient enough system for these plants to get very large. Because they rely on diffusion, water has to move slowly through one cell and then into the next. So it would take forever for water to travel up a long root system to the shoot system of the plant. Instead, bryophytes don't have roots at all. If you've ever pulled up a chunk of moss off of a rock, you may have noticed that they are barely anchored on and don't have roots. Because they can't draw water from a large area, they need to live in moist environments. When plants were all aquatic, they could use the water to spread their reproductive cells. Bryophytes still rely on water to do this, so again they need to live in a moist environment. Bryophytes do not have flowers or produce pollen. They have a very strange reproductive system that happens over 2 generations. What you're seeing here is actually 2 generations of the moss. The spongy part of the moss is one adult moss, and the stalks growing out of it are a second adult individual. The spongy adult is haploid, meaning its cells only have one copy of each chromosome. And this haploid adult moss can be either male or female. In the stalks of the moss are diploid adult mosses. They each have 2 sets of chromosomes, and they're hermaphroditic. So let's look at how this complex reproductive cycle works. We start with a haploid spongy moss. The male haploid moss releases sperm into water. Those sperm swim to female haploid moss, where they fertilize the eggs. When the egg and sperm fuse, they combine their chromosomes and produce a diploid moss, which again are in those stalks above the haploid spongy moss. That diploid embryo develops into an adult diploid moss, but it doesn't grow into a new spongy moss plant. It lives its whole life attached to its haploid mother plant, which provides it with nutrients and water. So we had a male and female haploid moss undergoing sexual reproduction, forming the new diploid adult moss. Now that diploid moss undergoes asexual reproduction. It creates spores that are haploid, so each has 1 set of chromosomes. Those spores can now germinate into new haploid mosses and start the process again. Now pause the video to answer this question. And pause again to answer this question. And pause again to answer this question. Peat bogs are really interesting and important ecosystems that depend on mosses and other bryophytes. Because the soil of a bog is so saturated with water, there's very little oxygen in the soil, and decomposition happens very slowly. So as plants die, instead of breaking down, they form this dense mat of partially decomposed plant material called peat. Normally, when plant material is broken down, carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere. But because decomposition is so slow in peat bogs, they release very little carbon dioxide. Instead, that carbon is stored in the bog, instead of getting into the atmosphere, where it can impact the climate. Despite the fact that peat bogs only cover 3% of the area as forests do, they store twice as much carbon as all the forests on Earth combined.